Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Miami Book Fair, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual evening with Achy Obejas to discuss her new bilingual poetry collection, Boomerang, Bumerán, published by our friends at Beacon Press. Achy Ovejas is a Cuban-American writer, translator, and activist whose work focuses on personal and national identity. Her story collection, The Tower of the Antilles, was a PEN Faulkner finalist, and her novel, Days of Awe, was called one of the best books of the year by the Los Angeles Times. Her poetry has appeared in Lit Hub, Prairie Schooner, another Chicago magazine, and many other publications. A native of Havana, she currently lives in the San Francisco Bay Area. To moderate this evening's conversation, we're joined by the wonderful Richard Blanco. Selected by President Obama as the fifth presidential inaugural poet in U.S. history, Richard was the youngest, the first Latinx immigrant, and gay person to serve in such a role. Born in Madrid to Cuban exile parents and raised in Miami, cultural identity characterizes his many collections of award-winning poetry, including his most recent How to Love a Country and his memoir, The Prince of Los Cocuyos, A Miami Childhood. Blanco, Richard, is a Woodrow Wilson Fellow, has received numerous honorary doctorates, serves as Education Ambassador for the Academy of American Poets, and is an Associate Professor at FIU. Throughout this evening's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by using the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen, and you can order your copy of Bumerang, Bumerang from Books and Books below. I love saying that. Bumerang. We truly appreciate every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual screen. Hello.
Hi. How are you?
Good. Wonderful. Thank you.
Hi.
How are you?
Good. Thanks, Christina. I love saying Bumerán too. I would have thought that the translation of boomerang would not have not been Bumerán, but it is. Welcome.
Yeah, there was actually discussion about that because in Spanish they use boomerang as well, like the English spelling, and there's also a spelling with the accent on the U. And it's all correct. So we had to figure out which one would make the most sense.
Yeah, it all works. So welcome to my virtual home here. I'm actually in Miami, staying at my mom's house where I grew up. So this is the good thing about using virtual reality here. So shall we just jump in, Hachi?
Sure. Let's jump in.
Great to see you again. So, of course, as Christina noted, you're obviously known as a prose writer, damn good one at that. And I remember when you first told me you were getting a collection together, I was like so excited. I was like, yes. So why poetry? And I guess kind of circling around that same question, what has been who have been your poetic influences, or what has been your connection to poetry as a reader and as a writer?
Well, poetry is actually how I started writing. My first publication was poetry, and it was when I was in sixth grade, so it was an early mark. Anyway, I mean, I've always been very close to poetry. I read poetry every single day, and I have probably for the last like 40 years. I make a point of it. If I read nothing else, I read 2-3 poems on any given day, and I've always written poetry, but I never. I never thought it was like something that I like could take seriously. Like for myself, obviously I took it very seriously, but I had notebooks and notebooks and notebooks of stuff, and I just let it build up. And the other thing was that I went through a period of time when I couldn't write poetry. I just couldn't find my way into it. I went years without writing, and it was actually Ellen Bryant Boyd who got me back into poetry, but it was in a very sort of weirdly mechanical way. I was having certain problems with my prose and with my fiction. it sounded a lot like journalism. And Ellen said to me, where do you write your fiction? And I said, well, at the computer. And she said, what do you use for text? And I said, Times Roman, obviously. And she's like, let's do something. Why don't you double space, find another font, and indent paragraphs and see if that looks different to you and if that sends a different signal to your brain. And I was kind of like amused by that, but it worked. And then I said, I wonder what the key is to coming back to poetry. And what happened was that everywhere I've ever worked, I've always worked with like a table or a desk and a computer. And at Mills College, when I was the writer in residence, they gave me this humongo desk that was like this L-shaped thing. And suddenly there was this unexpected space for like writing by hand. And what I discovered was that once I was sort of free to write by hand again, poetry came screaming back. So that was really interesting. And I started producing quite a bit. And the book kind of came around as a result of the chapbook. This is What Happened in Our Other Life, which happened because Lawrence Schimmel, who I think you know,
yes.
Lawrence and I go way back. And when I lived in Chicago, he used to come to the city about once a year and usually stay with me for about a week. He had some crazy sci-fi conference or something in Wisconsin. And every year he'd go through my spiral notebooks and stuff and say, you got to publish some of this stuff. And I was like, yeah, sure. And so he actually put together the chapbook, and which turned out to do quite well. And I think it's the bestseller for his imprint. And so I don't know, I was producing a lot and I just decided to try and piece something together, and I really got into it. So I'm really happy with it.
That's quite interesting. I always tell my students that, get in your body and go outside with your hand, write with your hand. It's amazing. Just go to the porch, take a notebook, and suddenly things open up. I have to do that all the time and leave my computer and write by hand. So that's really amazing.
I still edit on the computer though, because it's so much easier to move stuff around. But
yeah. I do both, and then like scratch out and then print out and go.
Exactly.
Yeah. But I wonder, you may be reminded me, and I wonder, this is sort of an off the cuff question, but I have a friend who's a very well-known prose writer who loves writing poetry, but it's kind of like she just keeps it to herself because it does in a way to like not mess it and like not dirty it in the world of publishing. And it's like your own private, right. You're serious about it, but it's also, you don't have to do, publicity and things like, you don't look at it the same way. It's just like, it's art for art's sake. And
totally get that.
Yeah. So that's probably, I kind of do that with painting, like just goofing around just to do something creative. I'm not at all serious, but like when I feel like doing something creative that I don't want to be, with the pressure of my ego or publishing or whatnot, I just, that or I decorate. But anyway, speaking of Lawrence, and he's a translator as well. So this book is both, it's a bilingual edition. So like we ought to talk about that as to why do it bilingual. Of course, you're a translator as well. And translating your own work, I know is like kind of really, I'm not a translator, but I can imagine it must be really kind of interesting, weird, and great at the same time. Your decision to sort of write this book bilingually, and did you you translated, but also both languages. So were you writing some in Spanish while you were writing in English, or like I wonder how that works.
Well, that's exactly why it ended up being bilingual, because a lot of these poems were in English, but a good number start out in Spanish. And to bring them into English then sort of created a kind of a bilingual semi-manuscript anyway. So then the question was, what do I want to do with these things? And also I think that the voice in Spanish is, I don't know if you find this when you read your own stuff back in Spanish, but the voice is different.
Yes.
And I also find that when I write in Spanish, my voice is even more different. So bringing that into English was a bit of a challenge. I despise translating myself, to be perfectly honest, because the temptation is to rewrite, you know,
Right.
and to revise, and who's going to say no, you know? What I ended up doing was, I made various decisions about the translations in this book. One is that we don't ever say what's the original, to sort of get away from this business of focusing in and obsessing about the notion of authenticity around a particular phrase or word. And also, I had help. I credit 4 people: Amabel Cuesta, Amanda Fleites, our wonderful Eduardo Aparicio, and Jimena Codina Gonzalez, who were all sort of instrumental in one way or another in either sparking the translation or polishing the translation or checking the translation, you know, whether English or Spanish. They have different levels of fluency in both languages. So I sort of set this up so that I couldn't get too self-involved with the translation by virtue of having, you know, the safety team, you know.
Yeah, so I'm gonna put you sort of check you,
exactly,
because I've co-created poems, and you're right. The temptation to, I go ahead and do it, but not a whole book, but a poem here or there that I do. Right, yeah. The temptation that when you're thinking in Spanish, you're like, "Damn, but that's much better. I got to reverse translate it to English," and then you change it to English, and then you're like, it's like no. But I'll do that with one poem, and you know, but a whole book you could get caught forever, right?
Yeah, no, I mean you can. It's just a black hole. It's just it's nowhere. And also, I made another decision about this book, which was to try to go at it gender free, which English, not a big deal, right? Because you just, I mean, there've been much more creative options for you know, a neutral pronoun, like Marge Piercy offered per, and June Arnold had na in The Cook and the Carpenter. But you know, the common usage of they as the singular non-binary has become very popular, so that wasn't that hard. I write in second person quite a bit anyway, so it wasn't a big deal. But going into Spanish was nightmarish because you know, Spanish is a very, very binary language, boom, 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 you know, and there have been attempts to create an inclusive language in Spanish, but and you know, the rules are still sort of being created, they're being made. The Spanish, this notion of inclusivity in Spanish is still sort of new. But what I was noticing was that a lot of the exercises in inclusivity in Spanish, what they do is they neutralize the person, they neutralize you know, the individual, but they leave the genderizing of the rest of the language, so that, you know, you get a neutral person sitting at the feminine table having some feminine coffee.
Right.
And, yeah, and I cannot find the utility for the table to be feminine and the coffee to be feminine, and there doesn't seem to be any kind of reflection of like relationship to masculine or feminine. I mean, clitoris is masculine. So that, you know, the ultimate female sex organ cannot be masculine. That doesn't make any sense.
Right. Or la ding, right? I remember learning that as a kid and going, and they would literally tell us, well, because it's in the kitchen, therefore it's feminine. And it's like la ding, and like,
yeah, no, it does not hold up for the rest of the language. You know? But so, I mean, I ended up just sort of degendering it completely. You borrowed the E, which is what's very popular among Spanish speakers. And it also makes it readable to use the E. Although sometimes when you read it, it sounds Italian or, you know, like some weird ass, you know, you know, hyperspace Portuguese or something. But it makes it readable anyway, and it was fun. It was really fun to do. But having other people to check me and to sort of question my reasoning for particular uses of it at any given time, that was really essential.
You know, I think it's brilliant, and it's really interesting how, you know, so many ripple effects from working with that, because it starts almost, I mean, when you read it out loud, even it just starts sounding like another language, and in a way, it's kind of you're kind of tearing apart like, one of the genders. Like you said, it's so binary, right? But you said something very interesting also in the note that there were places where you specifically wanted to keep the gender, and I thought that was brilliant because you know what, we don't need to degender everything. Sometimes we want, as authors, we get to choose that we want this to be gendered because it is a gender-rich experience. So
no, that actually was a real after the fact discovery. I totally degendered the entire manuscript, and then as I was reading it over, and I've read every word of this manuscript aloud probably like 13 times, I realized, whoa, certain things just made no sense degendered. Like my mother could not be degendered. My mother is very much a woman of a particular time. And there's a poem also in which she's standing behind Hemingway in line at a bakery in Havana. And, you can't degender Hemingway. I mean, it's like
virtually impossible.
Poster boy for toxic masculinity. I mean, there were things like that. And so I went back and I, very subtly reinserted gender around them, but kept the rest of the world degendered around them. So it was actually a fascinating journey to have to examine every single instance and think about it,
So you want to share a poem with us so we can finally put it out in the air and see what we're talking about?
I actually think that what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a poem in Spanish, just to give you, since we're talking about that, just to kind of get a better sense of it. And I'm going to read Mi amante isleñe, my island lover. Okay. Mi amante isleñe emergió de la espuma de la saliva de un cerdo salvaje que ella masacró con sus propias manos. Mi amante isleñe camina al perímetro de nuestra maldita circunstancia, inmune al hedor del puerto, indiferente a las desaventuradas centinelas. Mi amante isleñe come solo la carne del arrecife y rechaza el agua, y las piñas y los mangos, excepto como protección. Está arte de las ofrendas a las vírgenes y de las vírgenes, y de la luna en el agua, implicando promesas de progreso y el sonido de los tambores como la llamada de un clarín. Mi amante isleñe puede nombrar a todos los animales que ha sobrevivido y a todos los conquistadores que ha envenenado con sus labios melosos. Los dientes blancos de mi amante isleñe perforan la noche hasta llegar a la historia de un día en la playa ideada para los ingenuos y los valientes. Tiene un pene de 90 millas que ella mantiene como un remo, un bastón, una lanza, para amar a una joven y a una mujer que volaron en una balsa, una cadena de caracoles arcoíris en un árbol muerte.
Thanks. It's brilliant. I love hearing that. I'm telling you, it's like it just pulls the whole language apart, and it's like I love hearing you read it. So that kind of like makes me think about a little bit about this next question. It's just like there's you're clearly pointing at something, right? There's in that poem as well throughout the book. It's a lot about immigration and exile.
Mm-hmm.
And I was obviously originally from Cuba. We don't need to say that, but the book doesn't even say Cuba. So, and I empathize. Well, I'm curious to see what your reasonings are, because I would like to say, being Cuban-American is a full-time job. How sometimes you just want to talk about that, but not necessarily to be on the nose. So sometimes I just look, I'm not going to put another palm tree in here.
Right.
Another Cuban reference.
Yeah.
But I'm going to talk about the emotion, right?
Right.
So what was it? What was that decision all about?
It was, I think, a little bit less of a decision than I realized. Initially, I noticed, when I read through it, one of the gazillion times I was reading through it, I realized that I had sort of stepped away a little bit from Cuba. And I think that's true in my life to a certain extent. In the in the 90s and early aughts, I was going to Cuba all the time. I was in Cuba constantly. I had a girlfriend who lived in Cuba. And so we were in this sort of long distance thing, but I would spend months and months and months at a time. In 1999, I was there, almost the entire year, with just a few respites to come out and, make sure my paperwork was okay. And then, as we broke up and blah, blah, blah. And my son was born. And when my son was born, I realized that my priority had shifted in some very crucial way. I'd always sort of imagined ending my life in Cuba. I imagined sort of growing old in Cuba, being in Cuba, finding some sort of reconciliation with Cuba. But when my son was born, the time that I would have used to go to Cuba, I wanted to use to go to Miami so that my son could know my mom and my mom could know my son. And it became such an internal shift to think about what I wanted to do with him and how I wanted to approach life with him. I mean, lots of things sort of shifted in very different ways. I mean, this is probably the most Jewish book I've ever written, other than Days of Awe. And it has to do with the fact that, again, of my son, because when, I'm not a person who like belongs to things. I, never in my life belonged to a synagogue until this past year, never really participated in any kind of like regular religious anything. I mean, I'm very iconoclastic, I go to my Santero when I go to Miami, that kind of stuff. But I wanted to ground my son in something. And so we started, doing Shabbat. I mean, never in my life had I done Shabbat at home. That was like a completely incomprehensible experience. I wanted him to have some grounding in Jewishness. So Sunday school required membership in a synagogue. So there I was, and it just things got like closer, And the other thing that happened to me personally is that I used to live in Chicago, where I was a very active human being in terms of the politics of the city. I was very engaged with a lot of different issues, and the police knew me fairly well. I had a long arrest record, and when I moved to the Bay Area, I mean, first of all, they didn't need another activist here. They got plenty, and I think I was very much a stranger to a lot of that stuff here, and I had to sort of reassess who I am and how I wanted to participate, and that also included Cuba, because Cuba is one of the things that I've always been so active with, and I really just it was just one of those things that I stepped back from. I still feel very Cuban. I mean, especially in the Bay Area, where Cubans are pretty rare. And when I hear anybody else with an accent like mine, of course, I jump across 3 aisles in the grocery store to find out who they are. But it's different, and I mean, it's okay.
It's changed. Yeah, it's changed for me over time too, and I found that I've stepped back a little bit too, just also for emotional survival sometimes, because it's like always something and always something and always something. And where I'm at right now is sort of thinking about the body as homeland. And I still had the same, like, especially when the embassy reopened, I thought, oh, maybe I'll get a little place in Cuba. And I've been going a lot, and then I've been going less and less and less and less. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we're just also, I don't know, cansado un poquito. No? Yeah. But I wonder in that context, I mean, when the whole SOS Cuba, the protest happened, obviously I felt excited, but also very cautious, like, because I'm like, we've been through this, and then nothing happens, and then then it's Tuesday again, and I wondered how did you feel about that, and having just written this book too, and well, not just written, obviously it took years, but having just sort of released it at a similar, around the same time.
Hold on a minute. What? Okay, good. Okay, sorry. I'm seeing like a lot of activity here. When it happened, I was in some ways taken by surprise, and in other ways not at all. And what took me by surprise was that the people we had been seeing sort of leading protests and being very engaged in all these confrontations, like with the Ministry of Culture and all that stuff, weren't actually on the front lines. They were all under house arrest. The Tania Brugueras and the Luis Manuel Otero Alcantaras. I mean, these guys were all like put away. And this happened so beautifully and spontaneously. I mean, just completely anonymous people, just everyday common people who actually stepped out and did this. So that was very inspiring to me. Of course, by the next day, it was a crushing experience to see that though the government doesn't have the money to, fix people's homes, they have plenty of money to have totally up-to-date SWAT teams with super modern militarized equipment to come in and basically crush the living daylights out of everybody. And I've been left with this very uncomfortable feeling because I feel like the regime only has so long, and yet I also feel like I'm falling into my mother and my dad's trap, because that was always their thing, right? The regime only has so long. It has to fall eventually. Next year in Cuba. Next Christmas in Cuba. It was always around the corner, and yet this regime manages to survive the most bizarre and intense resistances. So I'm confused. I feel a lot of pain for people in Cuba. I still have people in Cuba, and I'm still sending money, and I'm still sending food, and so I feel very much like right now I am the least likely person to predict anything or to, I feel very present tense about Cuba,
Yeah, day by day. Yeah, it's interesting how now we look back and realize at some point our parents also, feeling like our parents, and also time is running out, right? Like it's not changing. Yeah. It's not changing. Something else you said I thought was interesting. I noticed also, as well as the protests in Miami, much different generation, right? A younger generation.
Totally much different.
In a way, it was like, that was refreshing. Also, not refreshing, that's not the right word, but it was interesting to see that torch is maybe still being carried or has been passed on in some way. So there is that as well. So,
well, I think that's also one of the things that gives me hope. I mean, whenever I feel, distressed about it, I look at who is protesting, and they're all very young, but also they're very strategic. They're very smart. They're very interesting. I mean, they're planning all these protests now for November 20th, and they've actually used the Constitution and tried to find permits. And I mean, that's no one's ever tried that before, and it really is a very, very smart strategy. Now, what will come of that, I don't know. And in terms of international support, it's very difficult to know what's going to happen. I never expect anybody to help go against the revolution. So it's always a bit of a Right. And I also don't know that I want anybody to help, because I do think it's our problem and we should figure it out.
Yeah. And then compounded with like you said, you have an arrest record. It's not like the United States has a perfect human rights record either. And as I've shared with you, half jokingly, but like, I was like, y'all ain't seen nothing yet, because we know from living it or from our parents' stories, like the chipping away of rights and how all that came about. So, you want to share a poem maybe that comes to mind?
Sure, I'll.
About not Cuba, but Cuba, not Cuba.
Yeah, this is actually a piece. It ends the book, and it's a piece called "The March." And I did a lot of research for this piece. it was really inspired by an exhibit here at the Oakland Museum on the Black Panthers. I have a friend in Chicago who used to be a Black Panther, even though she's not Black. It's just one of those things. And she came in for the exhibit. So I got this like bird's eye view of it and this sort of running commentary about it all. And it sort of took me back to, that time of super high idealism and also reminded me of my own sort of past in terms of marching and getting arrested and all that stuff, with all the stuff that we've, marched and, for and against. So anyway, it's called The March. I am about to step outside. I am about to step outside to the elements, and my anticipation is a long inhalation that covers the world upon release. This is the beginning of a movement based on facts and not on sentiment or pronouncements, though both sentiment and pronouncements are useful and worthy. As I begin to lift my left foot, my sartorius muscle allows my knee to move up towards my body. I am joined by others, however they can join with me, others who have suffered and are not afraid to continue suffering. What we seek is a new majority rooted in justice for all, whose conscience is committed to ceasing wrongs and doing right. What we want is nothing about us without us. What we want is for each individual to define their own identity and expect that society will respect them. We shift our weight, unlock our knees, arrange our bodies in the best way for each of us. For an instant, most of us are standing on one foot. We're not in a hurry. We're not dreaming. We're ready to give up everything, even our lives. We shall do it without violence, because that is our conviction. What we want is freedom. What we want is the power to determine our destiny. As my left foot comes down, it is coordinated with my right, and they match the equivalent movement of those who have joined me and with whom I am joining. We are firmly rooted. Whenever possible, we let our limbs swing in a natural motion and keep our heads facing forward. What we want is the complete elimination of military forces, not just from this or that territory, but from every corner, every outpost on Earth. What we want is full and meaningful employment. What we want is decent, safe housing. What we want is an education that teaches us our true histories and their consequences on the present. As each of us lifts our right foot or makes the equivalent movement to ambulate, we are now a perfectly synchronized force, even in our differences and occasional disorder. What we want is an immediate stop to state brutality and the assassination of Black people and Native people and disabled people and queer people and trans people and women and children and mothers and fathers who can only do so much because they are shackled by the very state that seeks to kill them for having foolishly believed they were free. What we want are the doors flung open to Folsom, Rikers, Guantanamo, San Quentin, San Juan de Lurigancho, ADX Florence Supermax, La Sabaneta, Attica, Camp 22, Pulsemore. It would be fatal to overlook the urgency of the moment. As we advance, we're in a thunderous thrum. Some of us will run under the rain in Seattle and toward traffic to block Lakeshore Drive in Chicago. Others will flood Wall Street and more will storm the Port of Oakland. There will be one lonely soul in snowy Bethel, Alaska, and clusters in Little Rock, in sweltering Ferguson, and Tallahassee and Flagstaff, Baltimore, Detroit, Honolulu, Boise, and ancient Salem, Wichita, Northampton, Oklahoma City, and Spearfish, South Dakota. Nerve and muscle adapt to the rhythmic stimulus of our own noise, the noise we make together. It is true that when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one person to connect to another, and another, and another, in order to defend our equality, our difference, our dependence on one another, then
that ending is that is just so, because you're wondering where you're going to go with this. What else could you add in, like, and then? But it just occurred to me hearing that and reading. I was following along on the page. There's such conviction in that, and yet in a way the poem is "we will," right? And, and you also realize damn, there's a lot of shit to take care of. But if the forces were to unite, like, and it's just, and then the tone of it is like, this, and this, it's just total conviction. And the rhythm of it too feels like a march itself. It's right. So
that's what I wanted. So I'm delighted. Yeah.
On so many levels it works. And then that blank end, then we will see.
Yeah. We'll see what happens. Yeah.
That's a ride, that poem. So I'll ask you one more question, then maybe we'll break for questions. I see 3 questions in the box.
Yes.
So the last section sort of steps away a lot more from the personal. Some of the poems feel like even a little bit like exhortation, and how did that, like, what was that choice? Or like, again, whether it's accidental or you own it now, it was a choice, whether conscious or subconscious, right?
Yeah, I was not doing a lot of marching, but I was doing a lot of thinking, because I'm in Oakland, or I was in Oakland during a good chunk of that period. And Oakland is a very political city, and not that Chicago isn't, because Chicago was very political for me, but Oakland is political in a very different way. It's a very personally political city. Everything is sort of, you have to sort of personally account for yourself in all sorts of situations politically. And so it was a constant sort of thinking about things. And one of the things that was also very clear, because of where I was at the time, I was teaching at Mills College, and Mills College is this very politicized space, was also the communality of a lot of different movements. In that poem, I use lines from the Trans Manifesto, a Disabled Manifesto, one of the Native American treaties, and because a lot of these movements, what's basically being asked for is respect, equality, dignity. See our humanity, see our needs. Treat us as you would treat yourself. And of course, a lot of it requires specific kinds of accommodations in order to make those things be true, whether it is, returning land or creating, something more than a curb cut for a wheelchair or whatever it might be. But it just, it felt like there was so much that needed to be done. And I was thinking about so much that needed to be done. And there's a way on which it can be very exhausting to think about that. But I also felt like this is a good thing to have these battles to fight. This is a good place to be if you're on the side of all these, truths and needs. It actually is inspiring, and it actually is energizing in a lot of ways. And I also began taking my son to a lot of small, safe marches, ones where no one was going to get beat up. And I wanted to expose him to that, and to think about that stuff. So I was having conversations with him about all kinds of stuff, even though he was 5 or 6 at the time. And I felt very like, an anthem, yeah.
Right. Passing it on, and in a different way, right?
In a different way, yeah. But, he'll make his own decisions about what's important to him, but it was important to let him know that we have a certain level of privilege, and he more so by virtue of being male. And even though we paid thousands and thousands of dollars for Cuban sperm, he looks like a Viking, so he presents white, and that brings a certain kind of privilege as well. And it was important that be, inculcado en su cerebro.
Right.
There was a lot of work going on, Richard.
It's interesting. You've always been that person on the marches and stuff, and you're making me think how I've never been able to be that person. Just,
there are other things we do.
but we all find our way, like you're just saying, like, and so I finally really just found my way. Really, mostly in the most recent book was giving myself permission to march in my poetry because the time was it was needed, right? Like, and I think these past 5 years I've never seen in my lifetime this overwhelming sense of reckoning and urgency.
Yes.
Maybe since the 60s. I wasn't around. I was born in the 60s, but certainly there's been protests, or at least they haven't. Maybe now they've always been, but now maybe we know about them more because of media or whatnot. But there comes a time where you have to give yourself permission to tell it. Tell it.
I thought this last book of yours was so different from all the others.
Yeah.
The tone was very different, and it was a more public Richard in a way.
Yeah, and for reasons we also talked about, I was stepped back from Cuba a little bit more, and this is another way of thinking about humanity, but right here, and it was a very different book, but this is about your book. But I can't help it because
we're just chatting, so it doesn't matter.
We can chat for hours alone on the translation and the Spanish language. Still, I have to I don't know why. I'm no scholar of old Spanish literature and Don Quixote, but does it have like a Quixote-ish kind of old? And when you change the gender, is that just my imagination? When you degender it, I just feel like there's this XCXX thing. I don't know. Never mind. Putting you on this probably,
Well, I feel like it sounds like a variant. Like it doesn't sound like Español as we know it. It sounds like a variant, and sometimes I think it sounds very futuristic, and sometimes I feel like it sounds, like it sounds like Portuguese to me.
I was gonna say a little bit,
sometimes it depends. I think on the word and like the construction, and also the intonation of the person who's reading. Like I read it very differently than somebody else might read it. So but I mean it's different. It definitely sounds different. I sent the manuscript to a friend in Cuba, and she read Volver, and she said, I loved it, and I love the poem, and I never understood that Cuban-Americans might really feel this way about Cuba. She said, but boy, I had a really hard time reading it because of that E thing. And she was like, I get what you're doing, and I want to do this, but I just can't take that step yet of making that my language. And I said, well, this is obviously a very literary language for me because I don't talk that way in Spanish, and I don't know that I could. I think it might be a language for the future.
Yeah.
I mean, some variant for the future, but for me, it's very, very difficult to even imagine trying to talk that way. Yeah, there are a few words that amigues, todes, that's become very common, but it's not.
What you were saying earlier, in a way, you're talking about accommodation, right? And like what needs to be accommodated, and this is one step in that accommodation, right? It's more than experimentation, but also it's a gesture as well. So
right.
So Christina, you want to come on and ask our questions? I see there's 3 in the box, but I get nervous with the box.
Well, this is a question for Achy and Richard. Any poets who have influenced your work? Thanks for sharing.
Sure. Achy?
I am a big reader of Bernardo Arenas, who's a dear friend of mine. And I also feel very indebted to Olga Brumis and Gertrude Stein. But I read all kinds of stuff. I read all sorts of poems and all sorts of fiction. I am totally promiscuous in my reading habits. And so, I can fall totally under the spell of a particular writer for a good month and a half. And then, fall madly in love with somebody else the next, the next month, depending on what I'm reading. I had a deep love affair with Ilya Kaminsky's The Deaf Republic this year. That was a big deal for me. I love that book. And Jericho Brown's Traditions was very important to me as well. I really love that. And of course, Richard's How to Love a Country also was, keeping me awake for a little while there last year as well. And there are some poems and some books that I constantly go back to. I'm always going back to Michael Ondaatje's handwriting. I always go back to Sunquith Reddy's Baxter Visitors. I always go back to Burmes's Beginning with O. Those are just standards. They just live on my nightstand.
Yeah, it was similar. I'm also very promiscuous. I mean, across genres too, and just reading all kinds of nonfiction books and even science books and whatnot. I think all that feeds our creative energy in some way or another. But if I had to say, I think different writers give us different things, right? So I first was given permission to write about my story by Sandra Cisneros and her poetry, and so I was like, "You mean I don't have to write about daffodils?" so I have that. But then, surprisingly, if I had to pick one person whose body of work has influenced me most, it would be Elizabeth Bishop. And it's interesting because sometimes people, I don't know, like sometimes I feel guilty that I'm not saying all these, Latine writers, right? Not that they're not in the pantheon, but I just find it also surprising and powerful when you see yourself in someone you don't expect to see yourself in a writer. You're like, oh my God, Elizabeth Bishop, you were in exile all your life emotionally. You never found home either. And so it gives me to see that same thing told in a different way, but feel the same connection. And then also kind of gives me more confidence to say, well, then what I'm writing about then should reach someone like Elizabeth Bishop. So, but I also like the idea of more favorite poems that I still read that keep on influencing me and teaching me. And so I have a pantheon of favorite poems. And when I'm writing, depending on what kind of poem I'm writing, I look to that poem and, God, I never noticed that before. And so that also is true.
Okay, here we go. Thank you. How do you know when you're done with a poem? I mean, when do you know to stop reworking it?
Oh, man. You want to go on this one first, Richard?
Yeah, sure. I don't, I think a poem has different life cycles, like a butterfly, like the making of a butterfly. And at some point it just has to go away and fly away and die somewhere else. But how I sort of decide, okay, that's it. One of them is a publication deadline, but that's not really true. I mean, I won't publish something if I don't feel it's close to done. But I just feel that when I get to a certain stage, there's one stage where I feel I've crafted, the poem has, the craft stands out, sometimes more than others, sometimes better than other times. But I also felt I've discovered something that I went into the poem not knowing about myself, about this world, about the subject matter, about someone in my life, about a memory. And I think when those two things converge, the idea that I've discovered something, there's some emotional truth in there that I've discovered, and the craft, and these things kind of happen together, I would say that's like sort of a good draft. And then from then and forward, it starts becoming more like editing and tweaking and fussing. And then from then on, I try to publish it. And then once it's published, I don't ask that question anymore. Even though when I read poems, sometimes I edit them at readings. I edit them because orally they work differently. Sometimes
right, I do that too. Yeah.
There's improv, but I won't go back and change it. I think it was, what was that Nobel laureate that from Spain, Ramon? He revised his whole body of work. He's like, I don't want to leave any of this shit behind. And
Oh my God.
it's a little obsessive, but how about you, Achy?
I've come to the realization that whenever I write something, I cannot judge it for about 4 or 5 days. That whatever when I'm in this writing fugue, it's such a high. It's like the best LSD trip in the world. And then, everything is beautiful and everything looks and sounds perfect and fantastic. And so, I have to contain myself from waking people up and reading it to them, or but I've come to the realization that when I wake up the next morning and I read it, it's a piece of trash, So I actually like let it sit, and then I go back to it and dick around with it a little bit. Also, I mean, now that I sort of understand my process more, and I know to take it from the handwritten to the computer to mess with it and to play with it. I usually, when I think I'm pretty done, I will maybe read it to a friend and sort of gauge from that, both the reading aloud and what it felt like in my mouth and what it sounded like, but also their response, and then sort of make a decision about whether it's finished or not. I think for the most part, I don't think it's finished though. Yeah, until it's published, or I feel like it's fair game for editing until it appears published somewhere. I had poems that I'd written like in the 70s that I totally felt fine about digging into because they hadn't been published. So I could do whatever I wanted with them.
Yeah, you bring up some points that I want to re-emphasize or emphasize. One is that, again, there's life cycle. So I put poems away too. And I just try to get to what I consider a decent draft. And then I usually read it to my partner and he gives me notes. And then I put it away because I'm just too close to it. The other thing is about the poem living in your body. So when I write a poem, if it's not coming out of my mouth right, it's not right on the page.
It's not right. Yeah.
If it's not in my body and I can't do it and I can't feel it, then, and almost like, but I should also say that sometimes we're the last to know when a poem is done.
Yeah.
That happens too. Like I'm just a little scribble that I did, like that you paid no attention to. That's how my third book came about. Like this poem that I thought was just like, yeah, whatever. Like I don't feel like working on it anymore. I guess it's done. Like that's also true too. Like I have nothing left to give this poem. It's like sometimes, it's almost like I don't have children, but I always say sometimes like you're just like, go, like get out of the house already. Get with you and caminate. You just like we got it. Like you just kind of, and so it's all over the place. I think the important thing is to always realize that the process is in some ways unique to everybody, and also somewhat mystical or miraculous.
Yeah, totally. I think there's something magical about it.
And thank God. That's why we do it. If we knew, it wouldn't be any fun.
Yeah, no, totally.
So Bessie would like to know, Matthew Lopez used Latin instead of X. Is that yet another way some people are neutralizing the language? And how many more things like this are coming? What else is coming?
Hard to know what else is coming, but the X is very much a U.S. Latino inspiration, and that's where it's been used, and it's very much an English ending. The X is completely unpronounceable in Spanish, and so it's hard to adapt it to create a Spanish, non-binary language because it's totally unpronounceable. In Latin America, I don't know who started it, but in Latin America, many different pockets of people have been using the E. I really don't know who the instigator of it was, but it seems to have sort of gained credence and gravitas in different places at the same time, and it seems to now be sort of an agreed upon way to do it. I noticed that it's starting to creep into English. Like at the Tonys last Sunday, the guy who won Matthew Lopez, I think that's what it was, the playwright, the guy who won, and he used the Latine.
Right.
And, and Remezcla, which is a really cool Latino website, has been using the E for a little while. I mean, they sort of interchange it with the X, but I do think there's probably an eventuality of the E coming. I work for Netflix, and one of the things that I do is I do a lot of like language stuff with Netflix, and we actually just had an incredibly long conversation because one of our writers was writing a synopsis about a movie that involved actors from Latin America and actors from the US. And, she wanted a kind of a catch-all for all of those people. And she thought, well, Latinx is going to do the trick for me. And we had to like back it up and say, no. You can't do Latinx.
Put an X on it.
And it was like, yeah, it's a lot wordier to say Latinx and Latin American actors, but that is sort of the way you have to approach it. There is no single term to encompass all of the Latin American descended people of the Western Hemisphere. It's an evolving situation. Who knows? I don't know what new inventive thing might come along, but something might. I'm open to whatever works.
Yeah, we had one time at FIU, we had a whole conference on it's called "What Is Latinx," and it blindsided me because the empire can be so being so Europe empire centric that it's completely like they hate using it in Spanish because it's right. There's like cancel, like they're like Latinx, like no tiene sentido, and I thought, oh yeah, I just thought this flows in any language. Latinx, just put an X on it.
Yeah.
So I was surprised myself to learn that. No, we got to contend with that a little bit more.
Yeah, but boy, white people love it though. I find that white people really, really love Latinx. When I was at Mills College, and Mills kills itself to be progressive. Like no one tries harder than Mills. Berkeley is almost bobos compared to Mills. The white administration like immediately like switched over to Latinx, and suddenly all of the Latino and Latina and Latine and Latinx professors and staff were like, nobody asked us, nobody talked to us. Has anybody, actually had a consultation about this? And, we wrote a letter and, the president was immediately like, well, we're happy to discuss this, and just proceeded to never discuss it and continue with Latinx. But I noticed the adaptation of Latinx has been super fast in academia and among white scholars. Yeah, boy, they love it.
Have either one of you seen The Chair?
Oh, God, yes.
I haven't seen it yet. I'm afraid to.
Some of it was very amusing, and some of it was like, oh.
Yeah. So do you think we might persuade you to read just one more poem in Spanish?
Oh, in Spanish?
Before we end the program?
Sure.
Because it was just fascinating to hear.
Yeah, it is.
Right?
Could have done the whole.
And I'd love to hear it.
Okay.
Just a little bit more.
Sure. Okay, I'm going to read Sucesión. Un amante puede ser evocado desde abajo de una sombrilla de playa a través de la mediación o con un perfil personal. Eso es cierto. En nuestros álbumes fotográficos, ahora efímeros, más como recuerdos que los propios recuerdos deberían evocar u ostentar, siempre se identifica discretamente al amante por la posición de las manos, la proximidad o la frecuencia de su presencia. Comenzamos con esperanza, aunque más tarde preferimos un sentido práctico que, esperamos, podría inocularnos de las falacias de la esperanza. Para comunicarnos, usamos solo diptongos, clics, y consonantes aproximadas. Recuerdo a la muchacha que gritaba tan fuerte que dispersó a los estorninos del sol negre, y le que me levantó del asiento del conductor, enterrándole pie en el freno antes de que pudiéramos estallar. Recuerdo al artista, los profesores, los tapadores, los zapateros, la mamá de 3. Las campanillas en nuestras muñecas tintineaban mientras dibujábamos en nuestros senos líneas cursivas en saliva y sangre. Y siempre, el movimiento no planificado, el impulso accidental e irresistible de morder, el moretón en el muslo como una diminutiva anémona acuamarine bordeada en rojo, el mal manejo de un instrumento en el momento climático. Templamos al amanecer o antes de que anochezca y siempre en los escalones de tierra del altar. Estoy boca abajo, arqueada antes de que puedas atraparme.
Bravo. I love that.
And
You know,
you have to see the text. Like
I was just going to say, I love listening to it, but I wonder what it's like. You know, it's a completely different experience to read it,
Yeah.
like on the page, right?
It blows your mind. Like,
Yeah.
and it's funny because also you're getting you when you're reading it, you're like aware of the degendering, so you start gendering, but you're like, stop doing that because I'm not supposed to be doing it because it's so fresh. It's so like, and then so it has this. It takes on so many layers. You're reading it also just on that just fascination with language itself, and then of course the subject matter and all the language and all the rest that falls into place. But
My eyes are here.
Ooh, hi. How are you?
I babysat my brother.
Did you
And
really?
this guy.
And
there
what,
they are.
did he behave or what did he do? Hey, how
This is el travieso. This is el travieso. This is el sensible.
He's
sensible y el travieso. Bueno, you know, together they.
He's the problem now.
He's my problem now. Did you hear that? He's my problem now. Ilana's resigning from his commission.
He's done. It's your turn.
Like I haven't had it all.
They're adorable. They're adorable.
Yeah, they're pretty cute.
So
I'm
thank
happy
you.
about it.
Thank you so much. Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Books and Books. You guys.
Oh my God, thank you. Thanks for supporting us. Thanks for being
Oh,
here
absolutely.
today.
And thank you for your
And-
many years of supporting us. I know that Richard and I both feel very indebted to you guys.
Yeah.
I
Well,
spoke for you, Richard. I hope that's okay.
Oh yeah. I'm like,
right back at you because you know we couldn't do anything we do without you. So you know.
I became a writer just so I could read at Books and Books. That's what I did.
I've heard you say that before. It's incredible.
The old store in the corner. I was like,
Yeah, the
we'll
one.
do
Yeah,
that one day, and that's what kept me going to school.
Yeah, I worked there when I was in college.
oh, yeah. My very first reading in Miami was at the old store. And,
Oh,
and
God.
I remember I got there a little bit early and it didn't seem like anybody was there. It was my first book and I was terrified. And I went for a little walk around the block. And when I came back, the place was packed and I just broke down in tears.
Oh, I
It
love
was
that.
amazing. Yeah, it was
Oh
amazing.
my God. What year? Do you remember? What
Yeah,
year?
94.
In 94.
Yeah.
Oh God.
I'll send you some pictures, Christina. I still have them.
Oh,
digitized.
send them to me, please. I would love to see them. And maybe we can use them.
Yeah, just so you can see,
It's
like,
going to be the 40th annivery
Oh my God.
in October of next year.
Wow.
So, wow.
Ow!
Okay, well, do you know the name of your mom's book?
Do you know the name of my book?
No.
No.
Boomerang.
Bumerán.
Ah, all right. All right.
Anyway, thank you to everyone watching.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.
Bumerang, available on Books and Books. You need a copy if you don't already have one. So, and October is the new December. So please shop early for the holiday. Shop now.
Okay, but
Oh my God, thank you. Thanks for holding that up.
Thanks.
Beautiful
Thanks,
cover
Richard.
too.
Yeah, it's gorgeous.
yeah, it's a beautiful cover. Yeah.
It's a
great.
flip book, so it flips.
That is gorgeous. Yeah.
Oh, nice. I really like that. That was Beacon's idea.
And Beacon is great. Beacon is great.
I love Beacon.
Oh, they're wonderful.
Yeah.
Do you know Sanj? Anyway,
What?
sorry.
You're turning into a family war.
That's right.
Anyway, good night, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
All right.